Last time we spoke, the Qing dynasty had enjoyed the first half of the 18th century with relative ease and prosperity. However, the end half and the emergence of the 19th century would not be so fruitful. The White Lotus Rebellion of 1794 to 1804 took root during one of the most corrupt-ridden times in Chinese history. One of China's most corrupt figures and one of the richest men in history, He Shen, was executed by the new emperor, Qing. Then, the Qing emperor had to quell the White Lotus menace, which cost the empire a possible 100 million taels of silver. Despite being successful, the White Lotus Rebellion would spread a seed of destruction for the Qing dynasty that would grow over time and bloom into multiple revolts and rebellions. But now we're going to look to another aspect of China during the 19th century, its struggle against the looming threat of Western greed. This episode is a West meets East story. Welcome to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, The Pacific War Week by Week, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, The Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have content going as far back as the Opium Wars of the 1800s, all the way up to the end of the Pacific War in 1945. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. Now, while the last podcast highlighted the corruption of He Shen and his long-lasting effect on the Qing dynasty during the last half of the 18th century, I intentionally avoided speaking about something. That something was the envoys sent by Britain to China to open up trade relations. The rationale was that I wanted to highlight why the White Lotus Rebellion came to be, and the British envoy stories would have really derailed it. But in actuality, the corruption, White Lotus Rebellion, and British envoys all simultaneously play a very important role in the downfall of the Qing dynasty. So let us go back in time a bit to begin what is quite honestly the emergence of one of the largest drug cartel stories of all time. Lord George Macartney was a well-seasoned diplomat with an extensive resume and a reputation for getting things done. He had the classic story of being raised in poverty, but rising to the top. He began his career as a barrister in England before entering the Foreign Service. He was no aristocrat, came from no significant family, thus earned his way through pure merit. His skills and intellect eventually landed him the appointment as envoy to the Qing dynasty to establish a British embassy in China. Up to this point in his life, everything he did was a success, but China would prove to be a hard nut to crack. In 1764, Macartney was knighted at the young age of 27 and sent as an envoy to Russia. It was a rather scandalous rumor that he was sent as an envoy not merely for his skills and intellect, but because he was good-looking, and it was believed he would sway the Empress, Catherine the Great, to the interests of Britain. After 3 years in Russia, Sir Macartney returned with the Empress's good affection, symbolized in a gem-studded snuff box. This bolstered Macartney into the social circles of the elites, and by 1767 he was elected to Parliament and soon appointed the Chief Secretary of Ireland. After some years of service within the United Kingdom, Macartney sought out more adventure and took up a post as Governor of the Caribbean Islands in the West Indies. He was soon awarded with the title of Braun, and in 1780 received the appointment as Governor of Madras, India. He worked that office for 6 years and became a Viscount. Then in 1793 he sailed for one of the most elusive and exotic lands, that of China. Viscount Macartney was given simple orders from George III to establish a British embassy in the capital and to get permission for British ships to dock at ports beside Canton. Now you might be asking, well, what's the problem with Canton? Nothing, except for foreign barbarians. It was the only port of access for all of China at the time. For those who have never heard of this, the Canton system, which began in 1757, was a trade system of the Qing dynasty. The Qianlong emperor faced numerous problems when he inherited the empire, one being the threat of foreign trade. While trade obviously is a beneficial thing, it can sometimes cause harm. As such, the Qing dynasty had some worries about trade with foreign lands. For one thing, the intrusion of missionaries had caused some pretty brutal conflicts in China. After this, Emperor Qianlong ordered his court to make some changes to foreign trade to thus stop more conflicts from occurring. He bottlenecked all foreign trade to go through Canton, and it was there they would deal exclusively with a group known as the kowtow merchants. The kowtow merchants were granted a monopoly over foreign trade, but were also the primary representative links between the Qing dynasty and the outside world. There were strings attached, of course. The kowtow merchants were to take on full responsibility for any foreign persons connected with a foreign ship that did trade. The kowtow merchants were, of course, expected to pay taxes to the Qing government for all the trade being done, but by far and large, they were able to control how they would levy such taxes. A perfect recipe for corruption. An event occurred known as the Flint Affair, a situation in which an Englishman named James Flint, serving the East India Company, was repeatedly warned to remain in Canton. But in 1755, he went against the Qing administrative warnings and tried to establish trade in some ports in Zhejiang. He was caught and deported to Macau, where he was imprisoned for many years. The situation prompted Emperor Qianlong to enact 5 measures against the foreign barbarians who wished to do trade with China. Number 1. Trade by foreign barbarians in Canton is prohibited during winter. 2. Foreign barbarians coming to the city must reside in the foreign factories under the supervision and control of the kowtow merchants. Number 3. Chinese citizens are barred from borrowing capital from foreign barbarians and from employment by them. Number 4. Chinese citizens must not attempt to gain information on the current market situation from the foreign barbarians. And number 5. Inbound foreign barbarian vessels must anchor in the Whampoa roads and await inspection by the authorities. Now, trade with China was beginning to really boom, but it was being frustrated by the bottleneck of Canton. The British were eager to open up more trade with China, and Macartney had instructions to offer something to the Chinese to open up that said trade. He could offer to end the importation of opium from British-held India, something that was officially illegal to the Qing dynasty, but in reality, the Qing could not stop the illicit smuggling of it into China. On the morning of September the 26th, 1792, the HMS Lion, a 64 gunship of the line, cast off for China. When Macartney landed on the coast of China, all of his retinue and baggage were transferred to Chinese war junks by the order of Emperor Qianlong, before he was allowed to travel up the Beihe River en route for Beijing. His ship had a large sign tacked to it on its mast by the Qing officials, with large black letters reading, "Tribute from the Red Barbarians." Now remember, at this time in history, China was basically the pinnacle of civilization, at least from its viewpoint. China had felt superior to the rest of the world for quite some time. Gunpowder, paper currency, eyeglasses, and all the printing press, well, they were all developed in China long before the West had acquired such things. As such, the Emperor of China did not receive ambassadors per se, as exchanging emissaries would denote equal rank amongst nations, for which China had no equal. Those who did come as emissaries were treated as tribute bearers and identified as foreign barbarians. From the perspective of the Chinese, foreign barbarians did not come to negotiate or make dealings. They came as subjects to pay homage and tribute. And so Macartney believed he was bringing gifts from one sovereign nation to another, but the Qing considered him to be a vassal paying tribute. The gifts he brought were the very best of British technology: telescopes, brass howitzers, globes, clocks, musical instruments, and an entire hot air balloon complete with a balloonist. That last one has always puzzled me, by the way. Did that mean the balloonist was just going to be sort of a lifetime servant to the Qing dynasty? In all, Macartney brought over 600 gifts for Emperor Qianlong, and this all required an astonishing 99 wagons, 40 wheelbarrows, drawn by over 200 horses and 3,000 people. Macartney was instructed to display the gifts at the Emperor's summer palace before he would be given any chance at seeing Emperor Qianlong. The Qing court apparently were not that impressed with most of the gifts, though they did admire the wood pottery, and they were particularly interested when Macartney ignited sulfur matches. Unfortunately, the hot air balloon never got a chance to take off. The viceroy of Puchili told Macartney that he would not be meeting the emperor in his palace, but in a yurt outside the imperial hunting lodge in Yuhe of the Tartary lands. They had to pass through the Great Wall, and Macartney was astonished by it, stating, "The most stupendous work of human hands, probably greater in extent than all of the other forts in the world put together. Its construction was a sign of not only a very powerful empire, but a very wise and virtuous nation." They traveled into Manchuria until they reached the emperor's summer quarters on September the 8th. The journey had taken nearly a year since they had departed England in 1792, and the success or failure of the embassy would be decided in the matter of just mere days. They stopped a mile from the imperial summer residence to make themselves presentable. Macartney had prepared a colorful and grandiose outfit for the occasion, as described by his valet. A suit of spotted mulberry velvet, with a diamond star, and his ribbon, over which he wore the full habit of the Order of Bath, with a hat and plume of feathers, which form a part of it. So, I guess I would like you to try and imagine a man dressed up like a peacock. Certainly, it was going to leave an impression. Not sure the one that he wanted, though. The entourage formed a makeshift parade formation with as much British pomp as they could muster. The British soldiers and cavalry led the way on foot, followed by servants, musicians, scientists, and other gentry. The parade arrived at 10 a.m. to their designated quarters, with no one at all to greet them. Macartney was bewildered. He had expected this famed Manchu man named He Xian to meet them. However, He Xian was nowhere to be found. Macartney deduced he must be delayed for some reason, and so they all simply waited. 6 hours passed by, and they all stood there in formation, waiting with no sign of an imperial official. Thus, they lost heart, and they went into the assigned residence to eat. In the end, Macartney was forced to go find He Xian himself. Quite an uncomfortable start to the venture. Over the course of several days, the mountain of British gifts were exchanged. They presented things such as rugs to the emperor's representatives, and in turn were given luxuries such as fabrics of silk, jade, porcelain, lacquer, large quantities of the finest tea. Oh, tea. Tea's gonna play quite a role in all of this, rest assured. The British tried to awe them with the products of their science, but soon they were realizing something was not quite right. You see, this entire process was very confused. For the British, they were trying to impress the Chinese to gain the ability to negotiate for more advantageous policies in the future, i.e., gain the approval to open a permanent embassy in the capital. But for the Chinese, the situation was literally just trade. They were trading goods. They assumed the British would want to take home and sell. Nations like Vietnam and the Joseon dynasty, they would regularly come to pay tribute to the emperor for his approval, which legitimized their own governments. They came and performed the famous kowtow before the emperor. Now, for those who don't know what the kowtow is, it's a ritual of 9 kneeling bows to the ground in 3 sets of 3 in the direction of the emperor. The envoys from places like Vietnam or the Joseon dynasty did this readily, as their nations were official tributaries to China, and thus the emperor was an overarching figure for their nations as well as their own emperors. But when Macartney showed up, he knew nothing of this entire process. Initially, Macartney did not even realize he was supposed to prostrate himself before the emperor, and when this was explained to him, he was unwilling to do it. Because despite the great admiration he had for the Qing Empire, he thought he was an envoy between 2 equal and sovereign nations. He assumed the King of England was on equal footing with Emperor Qianlong. Macartney had never done anything like the kowtow for his own king. Why should he do it to a foreign king? So Macartney expected what he considered a mere ceremony to be waved off, and submitted a request for that to be so, which he alleged later he received approval for. But when he arrived at Juhol, by the way, I'm just going to state it right here, I'm using some sources which are literally British sources from the 19th century, so there will sometimes be a discrepancy in the names of places because they're either using old names or they are just writing out what they think the names of these places sounds like, and it gets confusing. As a rule of thumb, I try to always use the current name of the place. So for example, Juhol would have been called back then Ruhr, but it would be most commonly known as Ruhr. Back to the story. Huxian denied ever seeing this request and insisted Macartney must perform the kowtow before the emperor. Qing officials at the scene assured Macartney it would just be, quote, a mere exterior and unmeaning ceremony. They said this, urging him to do it. Things began to get a bit messy. Macartney said he would kowtow readily if a Qing official would do the same before a portrait he had brought of King George III. No Qing official would do it, so Macartney tried to compromise. What if he simply bent the knee and head once before Emperor Qianlong? To Macartney's relief, the proposal was accepted. A few more days went by, then on September the 14th, he was informed he could meet the emperor. So Macartney got into his peacock suit and his entourage marched behind him as he was carried on a litter and he made his way to the emperor's ceremonial tent. Macartney entered carrying a jeweled encrusted golden box containing a letter from King George III. In his own account, Macartney stated he knelt on one knee, as agreed, and presented the emperor the box, and the emperor did not seem in the slightest to have made any commotion about the ritual not being performed properly. Macartney said of the moment, Emperor Qianlong's eyes were full and clear as his countenance was open, despite the dark and gloomy demeanor we had expected to find. Now, do not forget, as I have mentioned in a previous episode, at this point in time, the emperor was, it's pretty safe to say, very senile. The letter from King George III was translated into Chinese carefully by European missionaries who made sure to take out any potentially offensive references, like, for example, anything about Christianity. The letter spoke about how Emperor Qianlong should, quote, should live and rule for tens of thousands of years, and the word China was elevated one line above the rest of the text whenever it appeared, and the name of the emperor was elevated 3 lines above the rest. The letter's translation thus had been done in such a way it really did not conform to a letter between 2 equals anymore. Meanwhile, while Emperor Qianlong read this, Macartney was simply awed by the tent that they were in. In his words, "The tapestries, carpets, and rich draperies and lanterns were disposed with such harmony, the colors so artfully varied. It was as if we were inside a painting. The commanding feature of the ceremony was the calm dignity, that sober pomp of Asiatic greatness, which European refinements have not yet attained." Macartney also went on to mention that he was not the only envoy present in the tent. There were 6 Muslim envoys from tributary states near the Caspian Sea, and a Hindu envoy from Burma, and they all performed the kowtow. Emperor Qianlong asked Hu Xian if any of the English could speak Chinese, and the son of a British diplomat, George Stanton, stepped forward. The 12-year-old boy, named George, stepped towards the throne, and according to his own diary, "I spoke some Chinese words to him and thanked him for the presents." Emperor Qianlong was apparently charmed by this, and he took a purse from his own waist and he gave it as a token of his esteem to the boy. That little boy became the first Englishman after James Flint to cross the wall of language between Britain and China, and it would shape his life thereafter. After the meeting, Macartney and his entourage were allowed to stay in Jehol for a few days, and were fortunate enough to partake in the emperor's birthday banquet. On September the 21st, disaster struck when a member of Macartney's entourage died, a gunner named Reed. It was the day before their departure date, and apparently Reed had eaten 40 apples for breakfast, which I have to say is one of the most bizarre rationales for a death I've ever heard in my life. Regardless, the Qing assumed off the bat the man had died of some contagious disease, and they urged them all to leave with haste. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the balloonist/scientist Mr. Dinwiddie had been busy preparing all the scientific instruments for demonstrations awaiting Emperor Qianlong's return from Jehol at the end of September. He had begun filling a grand hall of the imperial palace outside the city of Beijing with globes, clocks, telescopes, the air pump for the balloon, and such. He had signed a contract basically stating he could never return home and would be stuck as a foreigner in a small part of Beijing. Regardless, he got everything ready for the emperor's visit. When the emperor came on October the 1st, he showed no particular emotion as he toured the hall, according to Dinwiddie. Upon looking through a telescope for roughly 2 minutes, the emperor allegedly stated, "It was good enough to amuse children." And after stating that, he simply left. Hu Xian and other Qing officials came to see the wonders and showed a bit more interest. Unfortunately, the hot air balloon demonstration was to be the grand finale in a course of a few days, but never came to fruition, because all of a sudden on October the 6th, the emperor ordered all the British to leave. Everything was hastily packed up, and every man by October the 7th was being pushed out as the embassy mission was sent away from Beijing. Once on the road out of Beijing, it dawned upon them all the embassy mission was a complete failure. As one British servant put it, "We entered Beijing like paupers, we remained in it like prisoners, and we quitted it like vagrants." Macartney had no idea how much he had offended the emperor with his negotiations. Back on September the 10th, 4 days before they met the emperor, Qianlong was always fuming mad about the English ambassadors dragging their feet about the kowtow. In fact, at the time, Emperor Qianlong simply told his officials he would keep the promise to have the meetings, but as far as he was concerned, they best be gone afterwards. Qianlong prior had planned to have them stay a long time to enjoy the sights of Jehol. But, quote, given the presumption and self-important display by the English ambassador, they should be sent from Johor immediately after the banquet, given 2 days to get to Beijing, to pack up their belongings and go. When foreigners who come seeking audience with me are sincere and submissive, then I always treat them with kindness. But if they come in arrogance, they get nothing. On October the 3rd, just a few days before they were ordered out, Macartney received the official response to King George III's letter. Unfortunately, it was all in Chinese, and he was unable to translate it for some time. It stated that the request for the British ambassador to remain at the capital was not consistent with the customs of the empire, and therefore could not be allowed. And here is the kicker in regards to trade and the gifts. Qianlong said this: I accepted the gifts not because I wanted them, but merely as tokens of your affectionate regard for me. In truth, the greatness and splendor of the Chinese Empire has spread its fame far and wide, and as foreign nations from 1,000 parts of the world crowd hither over mountains and seas to pay us their homage and bring us the rarest and most precious offerings, what is it that we can want here? Strange and costly objects do not interest me. We possess all things. I set no value on objects, strange or ingenious, and I have no use for your country's manufactures. Ouch. And there was a second little part that went on after that. We have never needed trade with foreign countries to give us anything we lacked. Tea, porcelain, and silk are essential needs for countries like England that do not have such things. And out of the grace, the dynasty had long permitted foreign merchants to come to Canton to purchase these goods. To satisfy your needs and to allow you to benefit from our surplus. England is but one of many countries that comes to trade in Canton, and if we were to give Britain special treatment, then we would have to give it to the others as well. Macartney was furious, and he wrote extensively en route back home. Can they be so ignorant that a couple of English frigates would be an overmatch for the whole naval force of their empire? That in half a summer they could totally destroy the navigation of their coasts and reduce the inhabitants of the maritime provinces, who subsist chiefly on fish, in absolute famine. We could destroy the Tiger's Mouth forts guarding the river passage to Canton with just a half-dozen broadsides, and annihilate the Canton trade that employs millions of Chinese. Sheesh, strong words. Yet, despite all of the military bravado talk, if Britain were at this time to make any aggression against China, it would immediately result in them shutting down their trade. If that was allowed to happen, both the economies of Britain and British-held India would suffer tremendously. Thus, Macartney knew the best course of action was to be patient and try again. And so the Macartney mission ended in embarrassment. Macartney would tell those back in Britain, "The Empire of China is an old, crazy, first-rate man of war, which a fortunate succession of able and vigilant offers has contrived to keep afloat for these 150 years past, and to overawe their neighbors merely by her bulk and appearance. She may perhaps not sink outright. She may drift some time as a wreck, and will then be dashed in pieces on the shore, but she can never be rebuilt on the old bottom." Very dark and ominous words indeed. Prior to Macartney's report, many had the perception of China to be the model of stability and of virtuous government. But Macartney ranted that, quote, "The tyranny of a handful of Tartars over more than 300 million of the Chinese. And those Chinese subjects would not suffer the odium of a foreign yoke for much longer. A revolution was coming. Macartney would elaborate further on what he believed to be the socio-political situation of China. I often perceived the ground to be hollow under a vast superstructure, and in the trees of the most stately and flourishing appearance I discovered symptoms of speedy decay. The huge population of Han Chinese were just recovering blows that had stunned them, but they were awaking from political stupor that they had been thrown into by the Tartar impression, and begin to feel their native energy revive. A slight collision might elicit fire from the flint, and spread the flames of revolt from one extremity of China to the other. I should not be surprised if its dislocation or dismemberment were to take place before my own dissolution. You have to love the grandiose way they used to write back then. And please take note, this is all coming from a very bitterly angry man who, yes, traveled the country for months, but had not seen the interior of China. He also could not speak or read the language, and knew, jack shit about the culture, to be honest. Yet, he was almost 100% prophetic of what would occur. Now, as I had mentioned much more so in the previous episode, the Qianlong Emperor was very old and going senile. When Macartney met with him, Qianlong had turned 82, and he had ruled at that point for over 50 years, an incredible reign. And despite the show the emperor had put on about never needing Western trade, in reality he was deeply fascinated by Western inventions. He cherished his collection of 70 British clocks, and wrote poems about them, and about Western telescopes. Likewise, he kept multiple Western art pieces and employed many Westerners in his court. Above all else, he understood the value of China's foreign trade at Canton, because a significant portion of the tariff income fed his imperial household. The Canton trade was also a primary source of silver import, of which China was the largest importer of silver since the 1600s. Foreigners came and were forced to trade with silver if they wanted tea or porcelain. Tea. It is the crucial component of this story. In 1664, King Charles II received 2 pounds of black, strange-smelling leaves from China. Less than half a century later, tea became Britain's beverage of choice, with an annual consumption of 12 million pounds per year. By 1785, Britain was importing 15 million pounds of tea per year from China. The people of Britain were literally addicted to China's tea, which, might I add, is a mild stimulant, rather ironically. More so, the British government became economically dependent on tea, and the Exchequer levied a 100% import tax upon it. Jesus. Although China purchased some British goods like clocks, it was simply nothing compared to the British need for tea. Between 1710 to 1759, the imbalance of trade was enormous, literally draining Britain of all of its silver. Because that was, after all, the only form of payment China accepted. During this time, Britain paid 26 million in silver to China, but only sold 9 million in goods. Now, let's talk a bit more about how this trade was being conducted down in Canton. It was the East India Company who was given a monopoly over the tea trade in China. I had mentioned the Kohong, or sometimes simply referred to as Hong merchants. They were directly in charge of the Canton trade, holding a monopoly over it. All Western trade had to come through them. If you were a foreign ship, your cargo had to be guaranteed by a Hong merchant before it could sail upriver to the port in Canton. Only a Hong merchant could rent you a warehouse, or arrange for you any and all purchases for tea, silk, and such. Personal relationships were thus key, and having a friendship with any Hong merchant was immensely valuable. Hong merchants were accountable for the conduct of all foreign personnel. If some foreigner got drunk and beat up a local, the Hong merchant was held responsible. And this did in fact happen quite often. The Hong merchants were a small group, typically no more than a dozen any given time. As you can imagine, with such a small group controlling the full trade between China and the Western nations, the opportunities for both sides' merchants to become abundantly rich was enormous. However, there was a ton of risk for the Hong since they had to take all the risk. Regardless, the Hong merchants were some of the richest men in China, but they also went bankrupt regularly. Why was this? Well, because of their access to capital, it made them primary targets for other government officials to squeeze them. You see, despite their monopoly on the trade, the Hong merchants were almost always in a precarious situation. Their appointment and finance was done via the hopo. Also, the social status of merchants within traditional Confucianism was very low, and the Hong merchants were at the mercy of other Qing officials. This led the Hong merchants to be forced to pay numerous bribes to said officials. More often than not, to get an appointment as a Hong merchant came with a literal down payment for the officials who got you the job. The Hong merchants were squeezed left, right, and center by countless officials in a pecking system built upon corruption and greed. The senior superintendent of foreign trade at Canton was an imperial customs commissioner known to the Westerners as the hopo. The hopo reported directly to the Board of Revenue in Beijing, and it was the hopo who was responsible for ensuring a proper flow of tariff income back to Beijing. The position of the hopo was one of the greatest opportunities to get filthy rich. Before the White Lotus Rebellion, the Qing silver surplus was a whopping 70 million taels, but over the course of the war, it is estimated the Qing treasury would pay something like 100 million taels in silver. Then came another disaster. The Napoleonic Wars had a tremendous impact on the world, not limited to just the war itself. As the war was grinding on, Britain was pressed for funds to finance its war against France, and this led them to squeeze the East India Company harder. The British government began raising its tax on the company's tea in 1795, then again in 1802, where it reached 50%, then again in 1806 to a whopping 96%, and by 1819 it was 100%. The growing British tax upon the company's tea led it to become a possible 1/10 of the British national revenue. As you can imagine, with those numbers, the importance of maintaining the trade with Canton became a matter of natural interest. While the Qing dynasty spent millions of taels mobilizing armies to quell the White Lotus Rebellion, the British likewise spent millions during its war against France. Britain would spend around 12 times more than its previous 22-year war with France, and it ran up a monstrous national debt. By the time Napoleon was defeated, Britain had doubled the size of the Royal Navy, and it was the most powerful maritime force in the entire world. Britain had acquired more territories to expand its already enormous empire. By 1820, the British Empire would control roughly a quarter of the world's population, almost rivaling China. The Emperor of China, Qing, was forced to slash the budgets of things such as the military after the internal rebellion was over. In expectation for an era of peace for the empire, the emperor effectively had to mortgage the future improvement of China's military to simply stabilize the country. Now, Britain's tea fix needed to be met, but its silver was depleted. The Napoleonic War and, well, the American Revolution had drained Britain of its silver reserve. How was Britain going to get the tea? The British needed to find something the Chinese were willing to pay for, in silver, and the British would find what it needed in the form of opium. The British were not the first importers of opium into China. Arab merchants had been selling opium cultivated in what is now modern-day Turkey since the Middle Ages. It was primarily used for medicinal purposes, such as being used as a constipation drug to stop diarrhea. Quite a useful thing to have to fight off dysentery, which rears its ugly head during times of conflict. In 1659, the East India Company began to export it in limited quantities from Bengal, India. The East India Company had a monopoly over the trade with India and tried to prevent the business of opium importing to China since it was illegal and could interfere with the company's legitimate business. However, to get tea required silver, and when the silver began to dry up, the East India Company's tolerance for the illicit business began to loosen. In 1782, the East India Company turned its eyes away and allowed the export of 3,450 chests of opium. Each chest, for reference, weighed around 170 pounds, about the size of a small footlocker. 2 ships carried the illegal cargo, and en route one of them was captured by the French, with another arriving in Macau. The Chinese merchants refused to purchase the illegal contraband until the price was dropped to $210 per chest. To break even, the British needed to sell a chest at around $500. It was a complete disaster. The British merchants ended up dumping most of their cargo at a loss in Malaysia for the price of around $340 a chest. There were no eager buyers for opium in China in 1782, and this is showcased by the lack of users, or better said, addicts. Nonetheless, the Qing government had made a decree in 1799 condemning the illicit trade. Foreigners obviously derive the most solid profits and advantages, but that our countrymen should pursue this destructive and ensnaring vice is indeed odious and deplorable. The East India Company proclaimed it was forbidding British ships to carry the illicit cargo. Because remember, they had to make sure the Canton market remained open to Britain. Yet this did not stop the East India Company from selling opium within India to independent British and Indian merchants who in turn might smuggle the drugs into China. It's some Better Call Saul stuff. It's not the East India Company after all, and the company could see no other way to acquire silver to buy the tea Britain needed. In 1773, opium earned the company around £39,000. In 1793, opium earned them £250,000. The idea was working, and the trade imbalance was soon shifting. By 1806 to 1809, China would pay out $7 million in silver for opium. During the first 2 decades of the 19th century, opium addiction grew in China at a slow pace. The East India Company kept the price of the illicit substance artificially high, which meant only the upper class in China could afford it. The East India Company was doing its best not to antagonize the Qing government, i.e., not rubbing their nose in the illicit trade. Thus, it did not increase imports and lower prices. Around 5,000 chests were being sold per year, and this stabilized the trade imbalance between Britain and China. No longer was Britain simply losing all of its silver to China, nor was China being depleted dry. So basically, they had an economic equilibrium going on. But then a technological innovation in Britain completely shattered this equilibrium. The invention of the steam engine in the previous century resulted in a mechanized production of cotton. Soon England had flooded the market with its mass-produced textiles, and the surplus of this found its way to a very eager Indian market. Those merchants paid for the product in cash. But how do you think they got the cash? Bingo, opium cultivation, and with it the need to sell more of it. So as a result, more and more opium began to flood into China. But it still had to go through the bottleneck of Canton. Problems began to occur, which affected the Canton trade. The Napoleonic Wars began to send ripples throughout the world, and one place that was affected was Macau in 1808. The British in Canton had heard rumors that France was sending troops to occupy Macau. The British wanted to preemptively respond and sent a naval fleet under Rear Admiral William Drury, in September of 1808. Drury sent a letter informing the Portuguese governor at Macau that he intended to occupy the city, to which the governor refused him and began to appeal to the Chinese governor-general for protection. On September the 21st, Drury landed 300 Marines who quickly seized the shore batteries at Macau, with no resistance being made by the Portuguese. However, the Chinese governor-general ordered a shutdown of the British trade in Canton. Uh-oh. The East India Company had to pay full cargo ships out immediately and abandon their factory in Canton. Drury, in response, brought an additional 700 Marines from India to occupy Macau. The Chinese governor-general warned Drury if they did not withdraw, the fleet and all the British residents in Macau would be cut off from food supplies. Drury panicked. He had not intended to start a war, nor were his orders remotely authorized to do so. When Emperor Qing got news of the British invasion of Macau, he was furious to say the least. Emperor Qing issued an edict to the governor-general in Canton. Such a brutal eruption at Macau indicates an effrontery without limit. To invoke such a pretext is freely insult to the Chinese Empire. It is important, in any case, to raise considerable troops, attack the foreigners, and exterminate them. In this way, they will understand that the seas of China are forbidden to them. So the governor-general ordered 8,000 troops at Canton to man the coastal forts in the vicinity in preparation for war. Drury got the news of this and knew the Canton trade could be shut off for good, stating, "It would exclude the English forever from the most advantageous monopoly it possesses in the universe." So Admiral Drury backed down, refused to risk war with China. Drury took the Marines out, but left some ships in the hope trade in Canton would be restored. And thus, 6 days later, the Qing governor-general restored trade in Canton. Phew, crisis averted. Another rather unusual conflict occurred when a British Christian missionary named Thomas Manning attempted to enter into China by land. Manning had tried asking the Hoppo for permission to visit Beijing as a scientist envoy, but was refused as the emperor had plenty of Western scientists at his disposal. The frustrated Manning then began to climb aboard East India Company ships going around Vietnam, to see if he could find a way to sneak into China via the Vietnam roads. This did not pan out, so he struck out at another place to get into China, Tibet. Manning went to Tibet pretending to be a Buddhist Lama from India, and would you believe it, he got an audience with the Dalai Lama on December the 17th of 1811. He climbed hundreds of steps and met with the Dalai Lama, whom he described. His face was, I thought, poetically and effectively beautiful. He was of a gay and cheerful disposition, his beautiful mouth perpetually unbending into a graceful smile, which illuminated his whole countenance. Sometimes, particularly when he had looked at me, his smile almost approached a gentle laugh. After meeting the Dalai Lama, Manning hoped to be granted permission to make the 1,500-mile journey to Beijing, but this would not occur. In the holy city of Lhasa, he was apprehended by local Qing officials, and quasi-imprisoned until Emperor Qing could be informed and send orders as to what to do. Orders finally came in February of 1812 to deport Manning and raise border security in response to the incursion. Then in 1813, problems reared their ugly head yet again for British-Chinese relations. The emperor had reduced the number of Hong merchants that the British were allowed to do business with. The larger issue at hand was the War of 1812, which had brought with it conflict between Britain and American ships around the waters of Canton. At this time, the Americans were second only to the British in the size of their commerce in Canton. The United States lacked cruisers to convoy their merchant ships, and thus began arming merchant ships into privateers. The American ships also tried to simply avoid the British by not landing at the same time intervals, but all of this would not avoid conflict. In March of 1814, the British frigate Doris captured a 300-ton American privateer called the USS Hunter and took her to Macau as a prize. 2 months later, the Doris hunted down the USS Russell up the Pearl River near the Whampoa anchorage, just a few miles shy of Whampoa City. They fired upon her while another U.S. ship, the Sphinx, was boarded and captured. More raids continued from both sides, and the conflict greatly angered the Chinese authorities. Eventually, the Qing governor-general cut off supplies and suspended trade with both nations, demanding they behave themselves. The British merchants in Canton complained they had nothing to do with the Royal Navy, but the Chinese authorities would hear nothing of it. Some minor conflicts occurred in Canton, and the British felt that they had been wronged. The East India Company began to demand the British government send an embassy to remedy the entire situation. So Britain answered the plea and sent another embassy mission in 1816. Lord William Pitt Amherst, Earl Amherst of the Arakan, was born in 1773 in Bath. His father was General William Amherst, and his uncle was Field Marshal Sir Geoffrey Amherst, who had a distinguished military career, including being the Governor General of British North America after defeating Nouvelle-France in 1760. Little William's mother died, and the widowed father would take care of William and his sister for a while until in 1781, when he also died. William would end up living with his uncle in the Amherst estate in Montreal, where I happen to live. William would eventually go to Oxford and become an accomplished linguist, learning several languages. Eventually, he landed a job as ambassador to Sicily, and by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, he was made a privy councillor. He proved to be able enough, and was soon sent as ambassador with plenipotentiary powers to negotiate with the Qing dynasty in 1816. The China Amherst encountered in 1816 was very different compared to the one Lord Macartney had visited. The emperor was Qing, the dynasty had quelled the Lotus Rebellion, and quite a few smaller revolts, mind you, and now the dynasty had a real problem with pirates along the coast. Emperor Qing had a loose hold over the empire and was not about to let some foreign power further threaten it. Amherst was a bit of an odd choice to lead the mission. He was considered a dull but well-mannered man who was not very talented in public speaking. He was neither brilliant nor particularly handsome, just hailed from an excellent family. Amherst brought with him two familiar faces: the former little boy who courageously spoke to Emperor Qianlong, George Stanton, who was now an adult. George had been working for the East India Company in Canton and had mastered the Chinese language and learnt much of its culture. The second was Thomas Manning, after his great Tibet adventure. Amherst's departure would be 6 months after the Duke of Wellington's victory at Waterloo in June of 1815. Thus Amherst would be coming to China to inform them that after the nearly continuous warfare between Britain and France for the past 22 years, it had finally come to an end. Amherst was instructed to make it clear to the Chinese that Great Britain was now the unrivaled dominant military power in Europe. The Amherst mission also was to remedy the Canton situation, but the perspective from Britain was quite off. They thought Emperor Qing knew relatively not much about the ongoings in places like Canton, and if they simply came and complained about mistreatment, that he would just offhand discipline the officials in Canton and place the British in a better position. The emperor, however, was hardly oblivious to the ongoings in Canton. In fact, he paid a lot of attention to it. The emperor had ordered an investigation into the Canton situation over the past few years, and Emperor Qing was particularly taking an interest into George Stanton, who he viewed as a potential troublemaker in China, because the man had vast knowledge of the language and culture and might induce more Westerners to do the same. For certain, the emperor was not too pleased to find out Thomas Manning was coming, as it was him who deported him. and it was to be presumed Manning should never step foot back in China ever again. So the entourage was pretty much already doomed to fail. As the entourage made their way, Amherst reported that the Qing dynasty seemed to have declined significantly compared to what Macartney had reported long ago. The entourage had learnt of the White Lotus Rebellion and how suppressing it had nearly bankrupted the Qing government. The entourage also became rather bold, and instead of waiting at the island of Chusan, Amherst's ships, accompanied by 2 East India Company surveying vessels, divided themselves into task forces and went to work dropping the embassy team off at the White River. Soon, some of the vessels began to explore the river networks, going as far as to where the Great Wall meets the coast of Manchuria. They sailed around the Liaodong Peninsula and parts of the Yalu River. Very, very bold moves. They also took notes of the villages, populations, and geology of their venture. They particularly noted down the lack of military installations. Both the Amherst mission and the Qing court intended to use the Macartney mission as a precedent, but neither communicated how they should go about it. What really loomed over the entire affair was the issue of the kowtow. Now, Amherst was coming into this with a less radical request than Macartney did. They were not asking for a permanent ambassador at the capital, nor the opening of new ports. They just wanted some kind of provision for direct communication between the East India Company staff in Canton and the high-ranking official in Beijing in order to circumvent the troubles they had been having with the Hopo and the Governor-General of Canton. They also wanted to be allowed to do business with others aside from the Hong merchants. Officials from Beijing met with Amherst as soon as the British ships anchored at the mouth of the White River in early August. They escorted him along the way, but also asked him to kowtow in front of a piece of yellow silk that represented the emperor. They wanted to see that the man understood how to do the kowtow. Amherst was given instructions from the British government simply to do what he thought best in the situation of the kowtowing issue, but to make sure the mission was a success. Thus, the first time he was asked to do it, he refused, and stated that since Macartney did not kowtow, why should he? The Qing officials were confused and said, as far as they knew, Macartney did do the kowtow to the emperor in 1793. Then they reminded Amherst the Emperor Qing was present in 1793 and would have seen this occur. Best he kowtow as well. George Stanton told Amherst they were mistaken because he never saw Macartney kowtow. As you can imagine, it was now a case of Emperor Qing's word against George Stanton's, a man the emperor did not like. Amherst was in a bad situation, so he simply stated he would do the kowtow when the time came, but stressed he would do it on one knee and not 2. He tried to compromise by offering to kiss the emperor's hand, which utterly disgusted the Qing officials. The highest-ranking Qing official escorting the foreigners was named He Shitai, the brother-in-law to Emperor Qing. He told Amherst he had to bow on both knees, or would be expelled from the capital without an audience. The entourage made it just a mile outside of Beijing, where crowds of spectators began assembling on the sides of the roads to see their approach. They made their way to the eastern gate at night, and the massive walls astounded them. They rode in springless wooden carts, a quite uncomfortable ride at that. Amherst was told his audience would take place immediately, and in fact, they were late for it. Amherst panicked. He was not ready. He was fatigued and unkept. His baggage had not even arrived yet, which held his coronation robes for the occasion. He did not even have the letter from the Prince Regent to be given to the Emperor. He Shitai told him he had to go now, but Amherst refused. Amherst demanded they be given time to clean up, gather their baggage, and rest. He Shitai eventually got another Qing official to grab hold of Amherst and dragged him to see the emperor. It is here where we get a lot of conflicting stories about what went down. In a classical one, it is said, the Qing officials grabbed Amherst in the middle of the night when he was very disoriented and tried to force him to perform the kowtow in a private room, hoping the half-asleep man would simply just do it. Apparently, it was George Stanton who grabbed Amherst by the elbow, saving him from doing the deed, and then they suddenly left the place before seeing the emperor. And as I can imagine, you were going to say, there's a lot of unanswered questions going on here. In another story, they tried to get Amherst to see the emperor, but he simply refused. And his entourage basically had to fight their way out of their lodgings to leave on the evening of November the 13th. Regardless, what is important to know is that the British entourage and Emperor Qianlong had no idea what was going on at all. They are both at the mercy of reports from the middlemen, i.e., the escort officials like Hu Shitai. During their slow journey back south to Canton, one of their ships, the Alceste, had bombarded a Chinese fort guarding the Tiger's Mouth River entrance to Canton. Dozens of shots were fired, and it is said 47 Chinese soldiers were killed. The Alceste had returned from surveying the Pearl River when the captain, one Murray Maxwell, requested permission to sail up to Whampoa anchorage so he can make repairs on the ship before picking up Amherst's entourage on their way back. Maxwell alleges he was taunted by the Qing representative to the Governor General, who told him that Amherst had been sent away from the capital without an audience. Murray Maxwell was thus denied permission to go to the Whampoa anchorage and was forced to wait on an outlying island. After about a week of waiting, Maxwell had it, and he decided to force his way up the river without permission. As soon as the Alceste began sailing, it was confronted by a Chinese fleet, and soon a firefight began. The Alceste began blasting away the Chinese coastal defenses, working her way up the river channel to get to the Whampoa anchorage. Both the British entourage and Emperor Qianlong were absolutely mystified as to what happened. The emperor sent his personal doctor to see to Amherst, whom he had assumed to be very sick for missing their meeting, only to find out the man was perfectly healthy. After some investigation, the emperor realized the entire debacle was the fault of the escorting officials, and a lot of that fault was on the part of Hu Shitai. It turns out the emperor had been lied to by the escorting officials and fed false reports. The British blamed the emperor for the entire misadventure, and the emperor was livid by everything. But there was a saving grace to the embarrassment on his nation's part. That embarrassment being the Alceste ordeal. When the Alceste made it to Whampoa, the governor-generals welcomed the ship as if nothing had ever happened. The emperor sent conciliatory edicts and gifts for the King of England as well. The emperor also sent a letter to the king, but he had written it before his investigation of all the matters had taken place, and thus he wrote that he blamed Amherst for the entire ordeal. The mission was quite frankly a catastrophe. Trade would continue unaffected, but now both nations had been humiliated. Now the Chinese would look with more suspicion upon the British, and the British hopes for extending trade outside the Canton system were all but dashed. As quite a fitting end to the entire ordeal, the Alceste, which was carrying Amherst and his retinue back to England, slammed into a rock and sank. England's response to the Amherst mission was disappointment. The entire situation aided one group of people in Britain, those who sought to abolish the East India Company's monopoly over the China trade. One major critic of the Amherst mission was Napoleon Bonaparte, exiled on St. Helena in 1817. He thought it was completely ridiculous that such an ordeal came about because the British fretted over kowtowing. And I wanted to end this podcast with some statements that he made. It would be the worst thing you have done for a number of years to go to war with the immense empire like China. What might happen if the dragon, as it were, should be awakened? You would doubtless at first succeed, but you would teach them their own strength. They would be compelled to adopt measures to defend themselves against you. They would consider and say, we must try to make ourselves equal to this nation. Why should we suffer a people so far away to do as they please to us? We must build ships. We must put guns into them. We must render ourselves equal to them. They would get artificers and shipbuilders from France and America, and even from London. They would build a fleet and, in the course of time, defeat you. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War podcast Week by Week, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have content going as far back as the Opium Wars of the 1800s, all the way up to the end of the Pacific War in 1945. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. The attempts at opening up more trade with the Qing dynasty were disastrous and embarrassing, to say the least, for Britain. She needed her tea fix, but her silver reserves were depleted, and thus the East India Company began to deal in the illicit opium trade. How could any of this possibly go wrong?